19 seconds. That was the precise duration of the ambush that dismantled a heavily armed smuggling flotilla in the flooded lower districts of Malvada. 19 seconds from the first suppressed muzzle flash to the moment 14 insurgents were left bound and gagged on the deck of their own sinking barges. In the regional command center of the Allied Continental Authority, located 400 miles away in a climate-controlled high-rise, intelligence analysts reviewed the drone footage and found absolutely nothing. The optical feeds were blinded by the torrential rain. The thermal imaging showed only the ambient heat of the tropical monsoon. The audio interceptors registered nothing but the deafening roar of water hitting concrete. The insurgents had simply been erased from the operational grid. The year was 2009. The Federal Union of Kintheria was suffocating under the weight of a massive insurgency. The Ashen Vanguard, a radical separatist militia, had taken absolute control of Malvada, an equatorial megacity built into the basin of a massive tropical river system. The monsoon season lasted for 6 months of the year, turning the city into a multi-layered labyrinth of flooded streets, overflowing subterranean drainage canals, and densely packed concrete slums. The Allied Continental Authority had deployed an intelligence and security apparatus costing over $1.5 billion. They brought ground-penetrating radar, high-altitude surveillance platforms, and algorithmic predictive software. They were failing on a historic scale. The crisis forced the authority to accept a deeply unpopular Allied deployment. The isolated island nation of Kalos, a tiny archipelago known only for its devastating annual cyclones, dispatched a unit of their military pathfinders. They sent exactly 34 operators. They brought no armored personnel carriers. They brought no signal intercept aviation. They arrived with waterproofed canvas gear, suppressed rifles, and machetes. Director Julian Sterling, the head of the Continental Authority's Intelligence Division, drafted a formal assessment of the Colossian deployment before they even unpacked. He stated that sending 34 lightly armed infantrymen into a flooded urban jungle controlled by 10,000 entrenched insurgents was a statistical absurdity. He recommended they be assigned to traffic control in the safe zones. He believed that flesh and blood could not survive an environment that was currently destroying his billion-dollar machines. He was fundamentally, conceptually wrong. Chapter to the acoustic washout failure of the Continental Authority was rooted in their reliance on pristine data. Malvada was a city that produced no clean data. The relentless, driving rain created an acoustic washout, rendering highly sensitive listening devices completely useless. The constant sheet of water falling from the sky acted as a thermal blanket, dropping the surface temperature of the city and making infrared cameras blind to human movement. The authority operated from dry, elevated green zones. They sent heavily armored columns down the main elevated highways, their diesel engines broadcasting their arrival miles in advance. The Ashen Vanguard did not fight the rain. They weaponized it. They abandoned the elevated roads and moved their munitions through the flooded lower sectors on hand-pulled wooden barges. They communicated using a system of colored tarpaulins draped over balconies, invisible to algorithms, but perfectly clear to human eyes. When the heavy authority patrols rolled overhead, the insurgents simply ducked under the muddy water, held their breath, and waited for the machines to pass. The authority was attempting to police a flood with computers. The Colossian pathfinders understood the futility of this approach immediately. They did not set up their command post in the dry, fortified high-rises. They requested an abandoned water treatment facility at the lowest elevation of the city, right at the flood line. The authority planners considered this a suicidal tactical error. The Colossians considered it the only logical starting point. They knew that to hunt an enemy that lived in the water, you could not look down from the dry sky. You had to sink into the mud, let the rain deafen you, and learn to feel the current. The methodology of the Colossian pathfinders was forged in the cyclonic storms of their homeland. Their selection process did not prioritize weightlifting or parade ground discipline. It prioritized the psychological endurance required to survive extreme sensory overload and chronic physical discomfort. Candidates were left in flooded mangrove swamps for weeks with no shelter, forced to navigate and survive while their bodies were slowly consumed by dampness and fatigue. They were trained to lower their core body temperatures, to sleep while submerged to their necks, and to ignore the panic that sets in when human skin begins to break down from constant exposure to contaminated water. When the 34 operators deployed into Malvada, they severed all ties to the authorities' digital network. They divided into four-man elements and vanished into the flooded slums. They did not conduct loud, kinetic raids. They simply existed in the water. They lay motionless in the toxic mud of the overflow canals for up to 10 days at a time. They breathed through simple hollow reeds, their bodies covered in the same refuse that choked the city's waterways. They did not look for men with guns. They looked for the analog signatures of logistics. A collision operator lying in the dark could feel the subtle change in the water current that indicated a heavy, submerged barge was being pulled upstream. They noticed the unnatural absence of feral dogs in certain alleyways, indicating a heavily trafficked insurgent route. They smelled the faint chemical trace of gun oil cutting through the stench of the open sewers. Over the course of 4 weeks, operating entirely in the blind spots of the authorities' billion-dollar surveillance grid, 34 men mapped the entire subterranean supply network of the Ashen Vanguard. They did it without a single drone. They did it by letting the city wash over them. The transition from observation to execution was imperceptible to the authority, but devastating to the insurgency. The Colossians did not launch massive offensives. They began a campaign of systemic, silent amputation. They targeted the connective tissue of the vanguard. A local smuggler who guided the munitions barges through the underwater debris fields would step into a flooded alley and never emerge. A mechanic who maintained the insurgents' stolen outboard motors was found zip-tied to a drainage grate, his technical manuals missing. The Colossians moved with the tidal surges of the river, using the loudest peaks of the monsoon downpours to mask the sound of their breaches. The Continental Authority noticed a sudden, inexplicable drop in insurgent resupply rates. There were no recorded firefights, no massive drone strikes, but the Ashen Vanguard was bleeding to death in the rain. Paranoia swept through the insurgent leadership. They abandoned their silent protocols and began using unencrypted radios to frantically locate their missing logistics officers. The authorities' signal interceptors immediately caught these transmissions, but the Colossians were already acting on the ground faster than the intelligence could be processed in the high-rises. The insurgents were reacting to a ghost that lived in the water with them. A predator that was perfectly adapted to the environment they thought they owned. The climax of the campaign arrived in mid-October, coinciding with the landfall of a Category 5 tropical depression. Through documents recovered from a vanished insurgent engineer, the Colossians uncovered a catastrophic endgame. The Ashen Vanguard, realizing their grip on the city was entirely compromised, planned to detonate the structural pillars of the primary subterranean flood control cisterns during the peak of the storm. The resulting cascade would permanently submerge the lower districts of Malvada, drowning an estimated 2 million civilians and rendering the city completely ungovernable. The explosives were already wired. The detonation was scheduled to occur in less than 3 hours. When the intelligence reached Julian Sterling, the authority command panicked. They drafted a plan to send two mechanized battalions into the lower districts. The Colossian commander flatly refused the support. He stated that the noise and vibration of a mechanized assault would trigger the insurgents to blow the charges early. The only viable approach was through the fully flooded intake pipes of the cistern itself. All 34 Colossian operators entered the water. They swam for 2 miles through pitch black, pressurized drainage tubes against a rushing current of contaminated floodwater. They emerged inside the massive, echoing cavern of the central cistern. What followed was 19 minutes of extreme close-quarters violence executed entirely in waist-deep water. The operators used suppressed weapons and fixed blades, moving through the roaring darkness with absolute lethal precision. The insurgent engineering team was neutralized before they could connect the final firing circuits. As the tropical depression raged above, threatening to tear the city from its foundations. The 34 operators stood in the dark, cutting the detonation wires, holding the weight of the ocean back with their bare hands. The morning after the storm, the floodwaters began to recede. The city of Malvada remained standing. The Continental Authority immediately issued a global press release, attributing the prevention of the disaster to their integrated sensor grid and their robust, high-altitude surveillance posture. The official reports heavily redacted any mention of the collision infiltration. The Pathfinders did not care about the press release. They packed their canvas gear and prepared to leave. The physical toll of their campaign was horrific. Nearly every operator was suffering from severe trench foot. Several required immediate medical evacuation for flesh-eating bacterial infections contracted from the sewage-filled canals. Multiple men suffered permanent auditory damage from the pressure of the subterranean pipes. They had won the war, but the environment had extracted a brutal, irreversible price from their bodies. They accepted this cost in absolute silence. Julian Sterling remained in his pristine, climate-controlled office overlooking the city. He read the unredacted medical reports of the collision operators. He looked at the staggering statistics of what 34 men had achieved against an enemy that had defeated an army of thousands. He looked at his billion-dollar screens, displaying endless streams of thermal data, acoustic algorithms, and satellite telemetry. For the first time in his long, decorated career, he realized he was looking at an illusion. He understood that technology was a wall built to keep the soldier comfortable, to distance command from the physical horror of the Earth. But wars were not won by avoiding the Earth. They were won by men willing to endure the unimaginable, willing to sink into the filth, the cold, and the rain until the environment accepted them as its own. Sterling closed the files. He did not simply delete his original, arrogant memorandum. He wrote a brief letter of resignation, left his security badge on his mahogany desk, and walked out of the command center. He bypassed the armored transport waiting for him in the dry garage. Instead, he walked out the front doors of the compound, past the bewildered security guards, and stepped directly into the Malvadan streets. He took off his jacket and let the relentless, deafening monsoon rain soak him to the bone. Standing completely still in the rising water, finally beginning to understand the world he had spent his entire life trying to control.